Picking up immediately where the previous installation of this series had left off, the key main strategic objective of the entire Albuquerque operation that was undertaken, as in the Kirtland Air Force Base, was under heavy assault by two comprising armored battalions of the 3rd Iranian Armored Brigade, as these battalions had been dispatched to strike deep into the installation and capture the installation, which would be achieved in a matter of merely 2 hours' time, as this was an exceedingly rapid operation to capture this large airbase, although there would be some heavy resistance, as again, the pararescue troops, as mentioned before, are no pushover and would put up the best fight that they were able to with the tools they had available to them to do so. As the Pakistani forces of the 18th Infantry Division were on the march everywhere, under the cover of their own artillery air power and the PLAAF's air power of the Chinese Air Force, the PLAAF. These forces were also supported by massive cruise and tactical ballistic missile strikes from the 176th Pakistani Artillery Missile Regiment, as well as the IRGC's, or the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps' 7th Al-Hadid Brigade, firing their Shahab 2s at the Kirtland Air Force Base in support of the operations being undertaken there, as well as also the 612th and 613th Chinese Strategic Missile Forces brigades, which were now reinforced brigades because they were reinforced by called-up reserve battalions to operate mass-produced cruise missile systems, the DH-10s, as well as also older tactical ballistic missile systems that were stowed away specifically for the use by these reserve battalions to add extra firepower to the brigades already firing the newest of China's tactical ballistic and cruise missiles, including the DF-100 hypersonic cruise missile, in support of the overall operations in the South Central Invasion sector as a whole. As the Pakistani forces of the 18th Infantry Division were comprised in a very similar manner to the 14th Infantry Division of theirs, who was fighting as a Trojan unit in the El Paso Fort Bliss battle. These forces, including their 2 armored battalions within the division, were equipped with the Al-Khalid main battle tank, the Viper infantry fighting vehicles, as well as the Talha armor personnel carriers, as the armored battalions were track-based forces, whereas the combat engineers and the mechanized infantry primarily utilized wheeled vehicles known as the Al-Fad, which was essentially in an APC version and an IFV version, as the artillery forces were equipped with the 155 millimeter M198, which was a very destructive and durable weapon as well, and were firing massive artillery barrages in support of all of their forces entering the city from all sides, as it pertained to their different forces of their division now on the move, which even included a single mechanized infantry battalion, which actually began on jumping off points that were within the city limits itself, as there had been a few CCP regime properties that were strategically purchased north of the Kirtland Air Force Base and I-40, which within hour 1, the Pakistanis had already eliminated a grouping of reactionary armed civilians just to the north of the airbase, and were now proceeding to block off any escape to the north, as the Iranians pushed deep into the installation already within the first hour with heavy artillery support from their own artillery, their self-propelled M109A1s, which were left over from the Shah era and were now in Iranian service within the 3rd Armored Brigade. These howitzers fired heavy 155 barrages onto the installation in different parts of it, as it was a sizable air base. And within the first hour, the PLAAF, supporting the operations on the ground with their very potent JH-7s, capable each of carrying nearly 20,000 pounds of air-dropped munitions, had assisted with the Iranian artillery as well as the Chinese, Iranian, and also Pakistani missiles fired onto the installation, which consisted of these cruise and tactical ballistic missiles, as well as this Chinese DH-10A cruise missile fired by their reserve battalions within the 612th and 613th Strategic Missile Forces brigades, as their combat air patrols for air superiority operations consisted in this area of the highly capable and mass-produced J-10 fighter aircraft, as the JH-7s pummeled the ground with thousands of pounds of HE, while the Iranian ground troops rapidly smashed their way in with their Karar main battle tanks, their BMP-2 infantry fighting vehicles, and also their Barak APCs, their Shahed 238 loitering munitions, as well as their Lynx armored reconnaissance vehicles and Sayed fast attack vehicles, which both comprised each of the armored battalions' armored reconnaissance company, as it pertained to the combat vehicles of each of those companies, as each of the armored battalions had 1 armored reconnaissance company, 2 armored infantry companies, 4 tank companies, and a headquarters and support company. These forces sliced their way into the installation with heavy air power, missile, and artillery support by the coalition, as these forces also had ISR dominance, as these Iranian forces had ISR assets at the platoon level, which was relatively impressive, as they also had high-altitude assets of their own and also were linked into the other high-altitude recon assets of the coalition, which even included satellite, which was higher, of course, than were the high-altitude recon assets, to provide a complete overlay of the ever-changing fluid battlefield conditions, as the AI processing network of China and Russia were rapid firing back to the combat data links in each of the Iranian vehicles the ever-changing battlefield situation by the literal second, constantly updating them, whereas in the old ways of using the combat data links, everything would have been done by analog, meaning that the troops themselves and analysts monitoring the ISR assets would have to manually input where enemy positions were, which took time and was not instant, such as what could be done by AI computing. And also, this AI not only saved time, but it also saved lives on the coalition side by preventing needless friendly fire incidences due to the rapid nature of the updates, as the friendly units would constantly know where one another was at every moment, and thus be able to perform maneuvers that were never before possible due to this rapid data stream, and also avoid friendly fire incidences. And there would even be danger close usage of munitions, but the danger close nature would be mitigated by the AI data stream, which was very important to modern informational warfare, as that was the future of war. and the future was now in the sense of this invasion, as all of this technology is absolutely real. China and Russia possess it, and other nations are beginning to develop their own capabilities in this regard as well. As Iran, though fledgling in AI, was already at the point where their ISR network was very impressive, with their satellites of their own, drones, and more. And now that these forces had smashed their way in, which included actions going on to the east and west of this center portion of the battlefield, which included the main runways of the installation, there were 2 attacking battalions now moving up in column formations after having smashed their way in on either side of the installation in an ISR-directed maneuver, as it must always be understood that the ISR assets not only played a role in the precision use of artillery, missiles, and other weapons, but it also played a role in the actual combat maneuvers, as the ISR assets could see where high concentrations of enemy activity was, including their movements and personnel on the ground, vehicles, and thus could direct the forces on the ground on exactly where to move as a result. As now, after the first hour had concluded, the entire south of the installation was now in Iranian hands, and their forces began to move in 2 columns to pincer the remaining American forces, as one battalion, the battalion moving up to the right or to the east, would leave behind one of its 4 tank companies and its armored recon company to hold this area down, which they had already achieved by the end of the first hour, as these tanks would even sit back and fire their relatively well-ranged weapons north in support of the forces now beginning to converge and sweep through the area after having already moved through the south of the installation, either side of these actions in the center, and were now racing to close a double pincer around a high concentration of American forces that were in the taxiway area of the installation. As in this area, Iranian missiles and Pakistani and Chinese missiles had already hit a number of targets, and more were inbound as additional Shahab 2s were coming down to strike these hangars and this administrative building in this area here, as well as airdrop munitions, as the Chinese JH-7 had come in a number of these aircraft, as 3 of these aircraft had alone dropped all their payload off map and within it, and had destroyed ample numbers of ground vehicles, buildings, and personnel as these Iranian troops rapidly rolled in with their armored infantry forces and their tank forces of their armored infantry companies and tank companies. This was one portion of a single battalion with 2 tank companies and the headquarters, 2 headquarters platoons, part of which is off map. But this is the 2 headquarters platoon elements, which the Iranian tank companies had 4 tanks in their headquarters platoon, as 2 were security tanks for the headquarters vehicles and 2 were command tanks for the officers and NCOs leading the companies, as they were partially off map for these 2 companies. This was an armored infantry company that had left its headquarters off map as well, headquarters platoon. This was part of one battalion, and this was part of another, of which these two companies were a part. The Armored Recon Company here, which these vehicles were one platoon, as they had lost one vehicle in this platoon. This is another platoon, and this was another platoon, with the headquarters of the tank company and Armored Recon off map to the south, while these other forces had moved up through their portion of the south end of the installation, as these forces were part of the same battalion as these two companies, with an additional tank company just off map coming up from the southeast, as there were two of the four companies, tank companies here, one of two armored infantry companies here, with the other armored infantry company coming up behind the other tank company off map. And this was the fourth tank company here and the armored reconnaissance company. And in this area of the other battalion, the 2nd Battalion, the Armored Recon Company is off map to the north. They're reconning the area ahead with their vehicles and quadcopter assets, as they had two tank companies, including their headquarters elements, with the 3rd and 4th Tank Company off map, along with the additional Armored Infantry Company, as this was only one of the two Armored Infantry companies. And as they moved into this area, as the area to the south, again, was where they would receive support from the companies that would sit back and fire their well-ranged weapons from their Carrar main battle tanks into this area, which slammed into this building, including even as these Shahabs were coming down to strike, and as these JH-7s were coming down to release their enormous payloads on this entire area, which would destroy not only the rest of this building, as these Shahabs would get this end of it, as this was a huge hangar building. They would destroy these aircraft on the ground, these Hercules aircraft here, and here, as well as the troops in this trench who were also being hit by tank shells from this tank company way to the south. And this sandbag emplacement, as these forces were moving by, they were doing a similar action to the massive drive-by that was done by the Americans in Baghdad, known as a Thunder Run. Well, essentially they were doing a Thunder Run through the installation to rapidly capture it before they would begin to send their forces underground to retrieve that which they had intended to be their war trophy, to bolster their nuclear weapons arsenal and program back home in Iran. That was their great reward for participating in the coalition, even though they would participate anyways because they were cemented into the Sino-Russian bloc and they needed to prove their worth as an ally, but they were receiving rewards in the process, which made the proverbial deal sweetened for them a bit. As the air defense missiles from the Shorad systems, the Yazara 3s of the Iranians, which were essentially a reverse-engineered Chinese HQ-7 system, which was virtually identical to it, were firing at helos that were in the air and still in the air due to the fact that there had essentially been training going on before this had begun, and as the electronic warfare assets of the JH-7s had utterly ruined radio communications, as well as the attack on the installation causing massive confusion, and the aircraft unable to get in communication with ground control, everything had eventually gone to hell for these helos who stayed in the air, not sure of where to go or what to do, now witnessing the pandemonium and being shot down as a result, as the Yazara 3s locked onto them and were swatting them out of the skies. As these JH-7s, having dropped enormous payloads both on and off map, were now about to pull up from their dive attack and were strafing targets on the ground in the process before pulling up, just as these JH-7s were beginning to descend to drop their payloads before they would pull up from their dive attack, which would give these free-fall munitions a massive spread over a relatively large area while still keeping them somewhat accurate at the same time, meaning they would hit what they were aiming for. And although they could drop Baidu or satellite-guided munitions, which were precision munitions, along with laser-guided munitions, which were also a form of precision munitions, they were equipped with free-fall munitions for the purpose of destroying larger areas at a time. As the missile strikes continued to come in, the airstrikes came in, as well as artillery strikes, although more limited in this area, as by now their forces had entered the area rapidly after fighting their way from the southern end of the installation. This had already been hit by a cruise missile strike. This was a hangar building that had aircraft inside of it. These were also missile strikes in this area from various cruise and tactical ballistic missile strikes. There were more off the map to the north, to the east, and to the west, of course. This whole area had been hit by airstrikes and some tactical ballistic missile strikes, as again, it was not uncommon for multiple systems to hit the same target, as this was a very brutal invasion. And as a result, that was a common occurrence in this. As these vehicles were driving by and firing at these forces, they were destroying everything in their wake. However, before some of these forces were basically removed from this world, they had managed to fire anti-tank missiles and destroy a tank in this column of vehicles, or this company rather, destroying one of their Karar main battle tanks while all these others are being engaged but not being severely damaged or destroyed. Although the ones that were destroyed were hit by anti-tank missiles wielded by the pararescue forces that were stationed on the installation, as they would put up the best fight that they absolutely could again. And they were targeting the tanks especially over even the BMP-2s and Barags armor personnel carriers, because the tanks were the most formidable of all the weapons on this battlefield. Before all these forces were annihilated, they had destroyed 2 in this column, in this company of tanks, and they would destroy 2 more in this company, in their column of tanks. As this wedge formation were some of these special operations forces. These helos had been swatted down by air defense systems, and this tank in this headquarters grouping of 2 headquarters platoons combined for this company and this company that were sweeping through this area here to do a double pincer with their armored infantry forces, as their armored recon of this battalion was off map and further north and about to slam the trap shut with this armored infantry company, which was already dispatching squads of troops into this area here to thoroughly sweep the area. As the tanks, by the time they reached here in this column, the surviving tanks, -2, they had effectively closed off this area with these forces moving in here. As this column would stop here, again, there were more companies off map in either direction, because these are not the whole 2 battalions, of course. And of this battalion, they had their other company of tanks in the south who were supporting the actions further north with their main guns. And of course, they had their armored recon company back here with them, holding the flanks. As the 2 armored infantry companies, they had one here, and they had another off-map to the southeast with their other final tank company, with 2 of their tank companies present, and 1 armored infantry company leading this column of this battalion. Whereas this is a whole different battalion with 2 of its 4 tank companies on this map, including elements of their 2 headquarters platoons of each company, and they had an armored infantry company on map, with their second armored infantry company off map, along with their 2 other tank companies of this battalion that comprised the entire other battalion. As American forces were becoming squeezed into a small area, as again, all of the movements were 100% ISR directed, as all the American activity could be seen from the high altitude, even higher altitude satellites, all the way down to the platoon level quadcopter assets scouring the area, which also helped to direct the loitering munitions strikes of the Shahed 238s on their targets. The Shahed 238s were devastating, and they were equipped with their HE warheads in this instance as it pertained to the fighting on this installation, as there were no heavy armored vehicles and the heat warhead was not necessary. As the missile strikes and airstrikes devastated massive areas, including tank shells coming from further south, as well as tank shells being direct fired into this area from the passing columns. These forces were being quickly eliminated, as 2 survivors here and the survivors on this side were fleeing this building. By the time the Shahab 2 came in, they were destroyed in conjunction with fires coming from these passing tanks, as the rest of this side of the building was annihilated by the airdrop munitions, as were all the aircraft on the ground. Even these forces over here in this trench, in this foxhole that was dug in this grassy area in the taxiway. And as these forces passed, they fired anti-tank missiles and destroyed 2 of the tanks using a tow missile that they had on a tripod mount, as well as also a javelin, which could use its top attack mode on the Karar. At least there was no IR or any type of scrambling, IR laser scrambling, so they could use the top attack mode with the javelin, as the IR signature could be seen without incident. An artillery shell landed immediately in a foxhole here, although it was somewhat danger close. The calculations by the AI system deemed it safe to use, and a 155 shell landed here and even cut down these personnel that were trying to take cover behind the foxhole edges, laying down in the prone. And although they managed before the shell struck to destroy this tank at the opening of this map, this tank is destroyed because these forces had fired an anti-tank missile at it. They'd fired a javelin on the top attack mode at it. The rest of these 2 headquarters platoon tanks, along with the artillery strike, just decimated these forces. These loitering munitions strikes coming in at the same time as tank shells and the airdrop munitions. This would be a very quick but very intense battle that would last 30 minutes, with the last 30 minutes of the installation falling, consisting of the recon company further north being followed by the rest of this armored infantry company and the rest of this one, who would basically scour the rest of the base in the last 30 minutes of the battle and end up pushing some of the remaining para-rescue troops and base security personnel into the adjacent Albuquerque Sunport, or airport, the international airport. As these forces were leaving their Barak and BMP-2s, they were stacking against these buildings, preparing to breach them, while this squad, although it lost a few troops in the front, would capture the remains of this foxhole. Even as these munitions were being dropped, they would already be running as these munitions blasted this large area and cut down these troops here. They would cut down the remainder of them with aid from a Frag T tank shell as they ran to take this position. As that occurred, this squad did breach this hangar building from this end, while these squads would eventually breach from this end. And as these squads were coming in, remember, there's multiple things happening at roughly the same time. Showing them in a coherent order is always difficult, but it will be attempted. As these squads were disembarking, and although this was danger close, the calculations of the AI yet again prevented friendly fire as these forces were racing into the area. As this BMP-2 and this Barak would be destroyed by this diamond formation firing Javelin anti-tank missiles at these vehicles on top attack mode, these forces would be destroyed by fire coming from the tanks firing a frag T-shell right in the middle of their formation and cutting them down. All as these forces were moving in to clear this building, and tank shells were being fired into the building on this side as they had cut these forces down with their remote-controlled weapons station, 12.7 millimeter heavy machine gun, and a frag T-shell, with other frag T-shells flying in and hitting these forces with a heat shells hitting these vehicles here, coming all the way from these tanks down in the south of the installation, who had earlier breached the installation. As by now, as these tanks had been lost again to well-fired ATGMs, mostly javelins using top attack mode, but some TOWs were used, the forces would continue on, although their armored recovery vehicles, which were further off the map, which were part of the headquarters platoons, would come and recover all the destroyed tanks, as a grand total of 7 tanks would be lost between the tanks on this battle map and the single tank lost on this map here. All would be recovered. Some would be repairable, others would be complete losses, including this BMP-2 and this Barak APC that were destroyed. They would be recovered by their own headquarters platoon, while a BMP-2 had fired one of its Concours missile and blew this MRAP to pieces at the very opening of the map, just like these vehicles are destroyed at the absolute opening of the map by the showering of thousands of pounds of munitions coming from these 3 aircraft, these 3 JH-7s dropping their munitions. This building would be completely destroyed by tank shell fire. HE tank shells blasted into this building and destroyed it, removed it. It's a rubble pile. This building was horribly destroyed by tank shell fire coming from 2 ends. This building horribly destroyed by tank shell fire, which originally is what caused them to come out and fire at these tanks. These dismounting infantry forces were moving into this area at the time this Shahab hit here. They were here, and now they were bounding to the rubble pile to check it. Also, tank shells were being fired nearly point blank into the building from over here in the parking lot when this Shahab came in and destroyed and made a crater out of this former administrative building. These personnel were trying to flee into this building, but they were being cut down by heavy machine gun fire from the tanks as these forces were preparing to go around. They had lost some of their troops in a firefight with this rolling diamond formation that was trying to run to this building, and they engaged them as they dismounted in a firefight with heavy machine gun support from their Barak APCs and their BMP-2 IFVs, with them firing their 30mm autocannon and shredding these troops to pieces. As that occurred, a BMP-2 fired 2 of its 4 Concours ATGMs and destroyed these MRAPs. As the loitering munitions came in and hit this grouping of troops trying to flee the area, another one would hit troops just off the map to the north that were now being pincered in by the recon company further north, and this armored infantry company moving up and out of the area as indicated by this arrow. As they tried to flee, they would be destroyed by the BMP weapons. The tanks fired their shells and hit this vehicle with a loitering munition hitting the other one coming down on top of it and destroying it, as a loitering munition would come in and hit these personnel here, along with tank fire. As the tanks would move into this area, they would see them and fire at them with their heavy machine guns. These personnel would all be cut down by heavy machine gun fire, with the rest that were alive trying to flee the area to the north, but would be hit by loitering munitions. As this wedge formation bounded into this area where this diamond formation had been cut down, they would hold their position with the tanks in this area as these troops came around to check this area, now badly destroyed by airdrop munitions and tactical ballistic missile strikes, which decimated this entire area. As these forces would check this horribly gutted building, these three squads here, and this squad again captured this position very early on. All of this fighting again only took 30 minutes. This was highly intense, but it did not last very long at all due to the amount of combat forces that were deployed into this area. They had completely surrounded in a double pincer forces to their north and forces that remained in this area, as again to the south they had a tank company firing in support, slamming shells into these areas here and supporting their other armor that was moving into this area with their very well-ranged main gun weapons. And as these forces had all been cut down, that ended effectively the battle for the Kirtland Air Force Base. The Iranian troops claimed victory and now pushed the surviving airmen into the international airport, which would be fought over later in the Battle of Albuquerque.